Guys, welcome back to the channel. It's your favorite reactor, by Reacts. And I had a lot of people on my last video, my last Bobby video, saying they need more iKON. They say, wow, I'm only doing Bobby. There's more people in the group. They want to see more videos from Bobby and iKON as a whole. So, okay, we have iKON's very own DK GROOVIN news video. So if you're new, make sure to subscribe, like, comment below any more iKON videos that you want me to check out. And let's jump straight into this one. I have high expectations.
All I wanna do is just dance, dance. 내가 원한 건 just groovin', groovin', yeah. Hit me when we going up. Yeah, we going high. 오늘 밤은 다 pull it up and pull it up. Feel it on the shot. Let's get it started. 전화기는 잠시 방해 금지 모래. 발을 들인 순간부터 스캔해야 멀어. 이름이 뭐야 인사부터 해 다들. 이 순간부터 you're my little shawty, yeah. 규칙 따윈 없어 오늘만큼만. 맘이 가는 대로 해 up to you now. 부재중은 너도 우리들만 즐기다 가면 돼. Pour up another drink.
Like, you know, like the beginning of the video, I said I had high expectations. Well, so far, it has exceeded my expectations that I had for the song and video. He has blew past my expectation. This song is really dope, ghetto. It's like a, you know, chill, like something, you know, like you just having fun in the club type dancing. Like it just, okay. We gotta check out more of DK. We gotta check out more.
조명을 낮춰줘 오늘 밤에 we keep dancing in the moonlight. 주인공이 돼줘 나의 밤에 all eyes on you. Let's get fucked up till sunrise. 너의 몸짓 세탁할래 가까이 와줄래 더. You know, baby it's alright. Come on, don't be shy, girl. All I wanna do is just dance, dance. 내가 원한 건 just groovin', groovin', yeah. Hit me when we going up, hit me. Yeah, we going high. 오늘 밤은 다 pull it up and pull it up, pull it up, pull it up. Let's get it started. 모른 척하지만 너도 날 이미 원하고 있잖아. 시침이 뜨지 마 이럴수록 안달이 나잖아. Just be cool and chill 기댄 okay. 놀란 모습이 귀여워 어때. 조심스럽게 웃는 모습에 빠져버린 난 이젠 어떡해. 조명을 낮춰줘 오늘 밤에 we keep dancing in the moonlight. 주인공이 돼줘 나의 밤에 all eyes on you. Let's get fucked up till sunrise.
You got dance moves. He's killing it. I like the little black and white filter.
Come on, don't be shy, girl. All I wanna do is just dance, dance. 내가 원한 건 just groovin', groovin', yeah. Hit me when we going up, hit me up tonight. Pull it up and pull it up, take a shot for me, girl. 오늘 밤은 왠지 너와 단둘이 보내고 싶어져 my baby girl. 춤을 춰줘 밤새도록 all eyes on you. Talking about us baby to the end. When we going up, hit me. Yeah, we going
Is that Bobby that I keep saying? Oh, yeah.
pull it up and pull it up, pull it up, pull it
That's it. I don't know if that him or not. They look, that gotta be Bobby.
Hit me up tonight. Pull it up and pull it up.
Yeah, that's him.
Shot for me, girl.
I like how they pretty much got the same energy. I like that. That was DK. Oh, first solo. Oh, okay. That's dope. I didn't know that. DK iKON first solo grooving. Amazing video, amazing singer, rapper. It's just really good. Like, I think it's really good. I'll make sure I check out. I'm trying to check out more part of iKON and like I'm gonna try to do some like group songs instead of like just Bobby. So he was just I think it was Bobby or seen in the video, and I like they kind of seem like they got the same energy. Like so I know I'm gonna like a lot of his like songs or whatever if it's like kind of like on the same level, or like maybe like he seemed like he like more, he does like a lot more dancing, maybe a little bit. I'm not sure. Let me know in the comment sections if you like some of the qualities and I see. Make sure if you're new, make sure to subscribe, like, comment below any video suggestions you have. And I see you guys in the next reaction.